There's a phrase that's been reverberating in my head recently, and that phrase is agnosticism as a way of life. Now, I think there's a misconception about the term agnostic, and I think a lot of people think that it means, like, whereas like atheist is, I don't believe in gods, and agnostic is, well, I'm not sure, maybe. Sometimes agnosticism is mischaracterized as a sort of atheism light. That's a misconception. Because one is about belief and the other is about knowledge. Agnosticism literally just means not knowing, without knowledge. Atheism, in my case, means without a belief. So I'm both. I mean, they cover different ways of thinking about it. But actually, I've been recently going further with agnosticism because, like, it doesn't just apply to gods. The reason I'm an atheist, the reason I'm assuming that there are no gods, at least not gods described in scriptures that you see, is that I know my limitations as a human. No human can ever really know anything with absolute certainty. We can be reasonably certain. We can live our lives as if we're certain of something, but, you know, at the end of the day, considering how all of us are imperfect, subject to all sorts of biases, we can never be completely sure that we're not under some sort of misapprehension. So, agnosticism for me is about accepting and embracing my ignorance, understanding and knowing that, at least knowing with near certainty, that I can't know anything with near certainty, and that I don't know is one of the most powerful phrases in the language. I don't know forms the sort of the basis of, like, the entirety of the scientific method. You can't get anywhere until you admit that you don't know. And given our nature, what we don't know is orders of magnitude bigger than what we do know, or what we can reasonably know. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to forever withhold judgment from things. I mean, obviously, we have to live our lives, and we have to make assumptions about the existence, or we have to make the assumptions about how certain things are in the world. So I'm not advocating, complete, like, I don't know anything, blah, blah, blah. It's, well, I guess what I'm advocating more is kind of like a certain kind of humility. I also feel like it's kind of freeing. It's freeing to realize that you don't really know everything. You're never going to know everything. And that's okay. It's part of the human experience. It's part of the condition we're in. I think that a lot of why people gravitate towards various religious systems is because it promises, I don't think it follows through, but it promises answers. like creationists, for example, will point to the fact that we don't know, like, what caused the Big Bang. We don't know exactly how life started on Earth. They will use this I don't know, and there's some weird Jedi magic, turn it into I know. It's very strange. If you find yourself in a debate with someone about that, and you point out that we don't know, like, what, if anything, caused the Big Bang, or if that's even a valid question, they will point to that and say, hey, well, you don't have an answer for that, but we do. God did it. That's obviously not remotely satisfactory. It doesn't actually give us insight into what happened. It's just sort of like a verbal, well, it's a thought terminating cliche. And it's a very strange leap from we don't know to now we know. And I feel like a lot of humans forget that this is not as good as it gets in terms of intelligence. Like, we may be the animal with the most kind of a certain kind of intelligence. We might be the animal with the most of a certain kind of intelligence. Where we can do abstractions and think analytically and reflect on ourselves and all that stuff. We might be the only animal that does that. But that doesn't mean that we are therefore entitled to understand everything. We're like half a chromosome away from a chimpanzee. Could you imagine a chimpanzee understanding some of the questions humans ask ourselves? Of course not. It literally doesn't have the brain to understand what humans understand, or to even ask the questions that humans ask. And I've heard it pointed out that, like, what if, like, try to imagine a species that is smarter than us to the same degree that we're smarter than chimpanzees. A species for whom quantum mechanics was, grade school. And people got it sort of intuitively. Imagine a species that could intuitively grasp quantum mechanics. Like, we can't, obviously. So my point is that I think that because of our self-reflectiveness as a species, because of our technological advancements as a species, because of how much we do know, people forget that there may be certain things that are permanently, for all intents and purposes, permanently out of our ability to fully understand. Like, I have a slight sense that the question of what started the Big Bang or what caused the Big Bang, like, is probably the wrong question, and we may not even have literally the brains one would need to even ask the right question, let alone arrive at it. It's humbling, and it is embracing our ignorance. Agnosticism as a way of life. Living each day remembering that there's so much I don't know, and that's okay, and that's fine. We can be okay with not knowing things. We can be okay with not knowing things. I feel like the society I live in and was raised in doesn't really understand or appreciate human limitations. Even though my country, USA, is technically a secular country, and many people in it live a relatively secular life, we still have a very strong influence from Puritanism, this Protestant work ethic. And I don't know why I brought that up. Protestant work ethic doesn't really have much to do with it. It's this idea of the Puritanism that I'm talking about, like, and Christianity in general. Conceiving of humans as something much grander and greater than we actually are. Like, we have these self-reflective minds, and it feels to us like more than what we are, which is, brains, physical brains with, lots of. It's quite mind-boggling, but what was my point? So I think it's a little bit counterintuitive for us, at least I wouldn't say intrinsically, but us now, counterintuitive for us to see ourselves as the frail beings we are. It doesn't feel like we have cognitive biases. The thing about thinking errors and things is that we don't, when they're happening, we have no idea they're happening. Until you're made aware of some of the basic ways in which human brains tend to act, you can have a really overinflated sense of what we're capable of. A book that I think changed my life, or was very foundational in how I think now, is You Are Not So Smart by David McRaney. It's also a blog and a podcast, which I used to listen to. I haven't listened to recently, but the book is about cognitive distortions, thinking errors, and it tells us about how our brains work a little bit, basic stuff, but the observation that we strive for consistency, not truth. We strive to reconcile things in our worldview, to reconcile our worldview, not necessarily make it accurate. We want things to line up. We want it to make sense, but we will often settle for things making sense without those things necessarily being true. Our memories are mostly fiction. We see what we want to see. We remember the hits and forget the misses. And importantly, we each have this narrative of ourselves as good people, and we have to maintain that narrative. And so, threats to the narrative that we're good people will, until, you can get a little bit more self-aware around it, but even then, threats to that narrative can be really disturbing. Anyway, the upshot for so much of it is just how completely unreliable our brains can be when it comes to having an accurate assessment of the world, having an accurate interpretation of events, being able to accurately predict events. Without a lot of help that unfortunately many people in the world do not have, without a lot of help, it's really, really easy for us to slide into delusion. Some delusions are relatively benign, or they aren't, but a lot of them aren't. So, I guess this is all coming back to my general idea, which is just internalizing internalizing, I'm just going to go ahead and say the fact that humans are really ignorant and prone to errors. Nobody is exempt from or immune from delusion. Even the most knowledgeable of people are still grossly ignorant about most things in the world. And mostly I'm just trying to convince myself and the world that, that I don't know is a thing you can say early and often. There's no shame in admitting your ignorance. If you didn't know something, you didn't know something, unless you somehow went out of your way to avoid knowing it. But, that's more of that's not most of the situations, I think. I don't think in most cases you're at fault for not knowing what you don't know. But I think one can be faulted for thinking you know things when you have no business claiming to know them. And that's why I'm an atheist, and that's why I tend to advocate that position, because there's no way of knowing for sure. And religious and theistic claims tend to be of the kind that lack some sort of verifiable evidence you can really grab onto. They often claim that you have to have faith, and now as a person who understands human ignorance, human delusion, someone who understands her own limitations, it's the idea of accepting certain claims about the cosmos on what is essentially wishful thinking. Well, I don't think it's a good idea. Obviously, I haven't just answered the God question that easily. Part of my agnosticism is admitting and understanding that there may be many forces at work that are completely beyond my ability to comprehend them. That's what I was pointing out earlier. I would use that same argument to say to people making claims about gods and souls that, they don't really have the basis to make the claim either. I'm not sure if that whole sentence made sense. We'll see when I go back and watch this if that sentence made sense. I just advocate embracing your ignorance. Use it as a jumping off point to find out more information. When you think you're really sure about something is a good opportunity to reflect on how easily humans can be deceived. I think that one of the many societal ills that I experience is this. I think there's just a lot of pressure on people to be sure of things, to know things, to at least claim to know things. And, to some degree I get it. It's kind of cool to see people who are really confident about things. But at the same time, I think that there can be another emphasis, and we can emphasize trying to know things, but we can also emphasize letting go of knowing things. Because sometimes in our quest for knowledge, we might be asking the wrong question without realizing it. Or we might not be able to admit that we don't know something in order to find out more about it. I know that, like, when I was younger, I think I was often plagued with, I was theistic for a long time, and I was raised that way, and I think for a long time I felt like there was something to know, like I had to figure out something. I was at, like, there were these big questions that I felt it was my responsibility to try to figure out. And I think I've mellowed out a little bit since my deconversion, since sort of embracing agnosticism as, philosophy, or as maybe not a philosophy, but an axiom. Agnosticism is axiomatic. I feel like I've probably been able to let go a lot of that attachment to questions that never really had real answers or authoritative answers. Like, I don't know, like, what should I do with my life? Well, that's not a question, really, because there's no should. Like, there's nobody, if there was a God that had designed me for a purpose to do some particular thing, it would be clearer, I think, than it's been in my life. Even though, well, music has been a big thing for me, I've also had a lot of identity crises and trying to figure out what I want to do. And I think part of that was coming from an overemphasis on an attachment to know, this attachment to knowing. And I feel like that trips a lot of people up. I feel like it leads people down these quote-unquote spiritual paths sometimes. It's not just a desire to find out the way, any scientist would have. It's this almost entitlement to know, this insistence upon knowing, this idea that I should know on a metaphysical level. I might not be articulating this well right now. Needless to say, though, I think I have a fair amount to say on the concept, on the topic of not knowing, of agnosticism. I hope at least that I have made the case that being an agnostic is not just like atheist light. It's not just being unsure about God, where atheists are sure about God. It's as I'm illustrating here, it's in many cases, for me, agnosticism isn't just about God, it's about everything. Sometimes life is a little bit like one of those finger traps where, if you pull, you just get more stuck. That's not everything in life. It's not an analogy for everything. You have to use your own judgment to figure out what is the best way to illustrate life for you at the moment. But in this case, on this topic, I feel like agnosticism is about, like, being stuck in this finger trap and then just relaxing your fingers. And realizing, I'm not actually stuck. This was in a way, this was like an imagined trap. I feel like so many of the mental traps we can fall into, are imagined. I mean, consider all the trauma, people believing in hell and trying to figure out what they should do to avoid it. kind of extreme example, but like, I feel like I've witnessed this in some people I know where they're so eager to figure stuff out, so almost pathologically driven to answer questions that often, again, are just non-questions. When you realize you don't have to know whether there's a soul. You don't have to know what you should do. You don't, even if there is a spiritual world, you don't have to know what it's like. I think I'm making less and less coherent sense as I go on here. It's late. And this stuff does make my thoughts a little disjointed sometimes. Well, I've been rambling for nearly a half an hour about agnosticism. I hope it made at least a little bit of sense to anybody watching. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, honestly. Like, if you are a self-proclaimed agnostic, does what I'm saying resonate with you at all, or am I kind of appropriating the term for something larger? Tell me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, please be tactful, and might as well mention I have a Patreon. If you want to, pay me a couple bucks a month to do whatever the hell I feel like doing, you could do that. And you could press the buttons that give me the dopamine. That'd be cool too.